So without further ado, let's get started. I'd like to welcome Will onto the stage here, and Will is going to take it from here and talk about the loot economy. Will, welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for the intro. I'm Will. I'm a co-founder of Syndicate and creator of Adventure Gold. Adventure Gold is a token that is available for the loot community and was made for use within the in-game loot ecosystem. Loot, as many of you may have seen on Twitter over the past couple of weeks, really took the NFT community by storm. And I'm going to talk about the a quick oral history of loot, and then the key lessons that NFT projects can learn from loot about creating a thriving NFT community. So what is loot? Loot was released by Dom, who was the co-founder of Vine and also made a number of NFTs, including Blitmaps, and he's working on Subdrive right now. And loot was an experiment, and it was an experiment that was a totally free, fair launch. He tweeted out a link to Etherscan and said, anyone can mint this, just pay gas, put in the ID number you want, and you can claim your loot. And the loot itself was text that is stored on chain that represents a adventuring gear in an RPG or similar fantasy game. So it's these items that you could potentially use in a future game. And the thing that swept the whole community up was just how much the community could do with it, because loot was novel for its simplicity, and that simplicity allowed a lot of people to envision what they wanted to build on top of it. So I saw loot. I actually missed the original mint for loot. I was hiking in Oregon with no cell service, no ability to take part in the mint, but I saw loot and I was immediately inspired by it. And I thought it'd be really cool to build effectively like an in-game currency on top of loot, because I knew that a bunch of projects would pop up on top of it. I thought that the on-chain aspect was very interesting, and I thought, okay, I'll build an in-game currency. So I created Adventure Gold. And Adventure Gold, I wrote mostly in 4 hours in an airport in Oregon, and then launched it live on a Clubhouse chat on the Good Time Show. And Adventure Gold is 10,000 tokens that any loot bag holder can claim. And those tokens, they were immediately used to vote on lore. They were also used to swap within the community for NFTs. They were used to permission NFT mints in a way that really expands the loot ecosystem. And Adventure Gold is one of many derivatives on loot. And this is what I find really exciting, is that there's so many other projects that have popped up. Two of the most interesting ones are Loot Mart and Loot Wars. Loot Mart allows anyone to unbundle their loot items. So you can turn your loot into specific items. I'll quickly screen share what that looks like. So here's loot itself. Here it is these text files that anyone can work with. Adventure Gold was launched from a tweet on a Clubhouse chat, and then Loot Mart lets you, I already unbundled my items, so you can see that they're unbundled, but Loot Mart lets you generate these items based on your loot bags, which is incredibly cool. And this is how they're leveraging the loot activity on chain. Likewise, Loot Wars is another project where you can battle your loot. So any loot holder can claim a weapon, and these weapons can then be used in in-game battles, which is a very, very cool aspect, because now your loot items are going beyond NFTs that are in your wallet. You can start to use them in this whole ecosystem. So why did these appear? What made them so successful? I think there's 3 key insights around loot for all of the subsequent projects that built on top of it. One, the first lesson is that less is more. Loot's simplicity of the text gave the community room for inspiration. The items, the NFTs the NFTs left a lot for the community to build. Like, you couldn't break the bags up into items. That was made by the Loot Mart team, and that allowed the Loot Mart team to make incredibly interesting art. And by giving the community less, the community was able to take that forward on their own in a way that allowed so many people to contribute. And that was, I think, the beauty of Dom's experiment, is that it allowed anyone to build on top of it and gave them so many ideas for what they could do next. The second lesson about Loot is this is one that's very important for any NFT creator, is to think carefully about the tokenomics up front. Tokenomics are the single most difficult thing to change later on. So for example, with Loot, there's 8,000 loot. There's 8,000 loot bags, and then there's also more loot, which is much more accessible and anyone can mint. And with the tokenomics, there's a debate in the community right now about whether loot should be 8,000 bags and whether that should be the version that everyone adopts, or whether more loot should make a really broad community and really spread loot to so many people in a way that makes it very accessible. And if you define the tokenomics up front will there be more tokens issued later on? Will there be a treasury? Will there be scarcity? Will there be abundance? Think through these things before you launch your NFT project, because afterwards it's extremely difficult to change and extremely hard to change, for example, from scarcity to abundance, or from deflationary tokens to inflationary tokens. Nouns is an excellent example of how to do this. Nouns is some of the best tokenomics I've seen in the entire space. With nouns, if you look up nouns DAO on Twitter, you can find them, and they essentially release one noun a day for auction. The proceeds from the auction go into a treasury governed by nouns holders, and one noun every 10 days for the next 5 years is reserved for the nouns team. So they've created a token that is scarce right now, abundant later on, with a treasury that is continuously funded to invest in the nouns ecosystem. And define your tokenomics carefully. That's probably one of the most important things for an NFT project. Currently, 10,000 or so generative projects are the norm. Nouns show that there's a lot of creativity that the community can do that will benefit the whole space. And the Loot and more Loot show that there's creativity in how tokenomics can work, and Adventure Gold on top of it also has many lessons for tokenomics design. The third thing that I think is really interesting is that on-chain composability is the future. Most NFTs, they store their data on a separate network, whether that's a centralized web server or IPFS or another platform. And most NFTs are not stored on the Ethereum blockchain directly. Loot was really unique because it was one of the few projects that does store data on the blockchain directly, and having that data be accessible to other smart contracts is what allowed derivatives like Loot Mart and Loot Wars and Adventure Gold to exist. Putting all art on chain is the holy grail, but even just having on-chain attributes helps a lot. So if you can make some of your NFTs accessible to other smart contracts, you can get a thriving community like Loot. And that on-chain data is extremely important if you want a derivative ecosystem, because the on-chain data allows the community to build on top of it in a crypto native way. Those are my three most important lessons from Loot and Adventure Gold. One, less is more. Give the community room for inspiration. Two, think carefully about tokenomics up front. Look at examples beyond 10,000 profile picture drops. Look at more Loot, look at nouns, look at other projects that have played with tokenomics models, because that creates a very different type of community that can often be very inclusive and fund an ecosystem in the long term. And then three, on-chain composability is the secret that made Loot work. And if you make some of your NFT data available on chain, you will see the possibility for derivatives to spring up, just like the Loot ecosystem. I wanted to make sure to leave some time for questions. So if there are any questions, I can answer them.
Hey, well, this is an awesome talk. So I think we're just getting questions in from the chat, and as people hear this sentence, we'll the latency and everything will start pushing more in. But maybe just to kind of start off with a few things you've already mentioned, it'd be great if you can give a slightly more detailed info on how nouns work. So we got a couple questions around that. So just walk us through what that looks like, and then maybe to back up a little bit, it'd be also great for those of us who don't know what loot is to just kind of go into how Loot started and sort of what it is now and sort of what people have done. So you talked about the side of how you got into this ecosystem from the Loot side, but what else has happened in the Loot ecosystem from other efforts?
Yep, that sounds great. I'll start with the questions about the loot ecosystem. The loot ecosystem, you can, I'll screen share again. As I mentioned before, let's see, I'll pull this up quickly. Great. Yeah, so every single loot bag has these items, and these items that you see are all available on chain. So anyone can query, any other project can query these items on chain. So this is how Loot Mart was able to operate, because if you have a katana, it can access, Loot Mart can access the data inside of Loot. And this is what I'm referring to when I talk about on-chain composability. And this is what's incredibly interesting. The Loot Mart and Loot Wars are just two of many derivatives. You can find all derivatives at lootproject.com, and this should give you a good sense of the types of development in the ecosystem. It's really, really incredible. Here is every single derivative of Loot. So we have everything from ability scores to abstract Loot, which made generative art based on Loot, to characters for Loot, companions for Loot. You name it, the list goes on and on and on of people who are inspired by Loot. And every single part of this is leveraging the on-chain composability. There's also different guilds, which is really interesting. Guilds of Loot holders came together to for like katanas or for divine robes to allow the katana and divine robes holders, for example, to be able to collaborate together and form their own sub communities within the larger NFT community. There's tons of developer tools as well, and of course the Loot Discord, Loot Talk, and then Loot builders. Loot all got started from Dom's tweet. I'm gonna see if I can find it on Twitter quickly. It all started from this tweet, and that's what it was. This was the origin of Loot. Everything else afterwards came from the community. Just this one tweet. Likewise, Adventure Gold came from just this one tweet, and the experimentation that the community can put forward is incredibly important. That's a quick overview of Loot. I can talk a little bit about Nouns tokenomics. I am not an expert in Nouns tokenomics by any means. I'm not involved with the Nouns team officially. I've just been following them since they're on Rinkeby. I put some tokens into Shark DAO, which buys nouns, for the community. So I'm not an expert in this, but I will give my best summary of what I find very interesting about it, which is that NFT projects in the long term should think carefully about how they cultivate their communities. If you have a really rich ecosystem of builders and contributors, you can get really, really interesting outcomes. One way to do that is to have a treasury. There's a few ways to build a treasury. One is a treasury where the payments from secondary sales, such as OpenSea royalties, go to the project. That's what some projects do. There's a discussion, there were votes in the Loot community about whether that should occur for Loot. Another way also is to reserve some NFTs for the community, where the NFTs are put in a treasury, and the NFTs can be used by the whole ecosystem. the really clever part about nouns is that most NFT projects, it's just a mint, and the team gets some ETH from the mint, or sometimes nothing. Dom gave away loot for free, and I gave away adventure gold for free. And then that's it. Whereas with nouns, they do an auction every single day, and that auction allows them to build up a treasury that they can go use to fund builders inside the nouns ecosystem, spread the word about nouns. And Nouns is able to accomplish this because they're releasing one noun every day. They didn't release all nouns at once. They instead released them. They're releasing them in small batches, and these batches drive community. These batches scale the community in a deliberate way, and it allows them to scale the community up from there. So I think that the 10,000 profile picture drops where everyone claims for gas and the or a small amount of ETH, and the creators make money off secondary sales is a model that can use a lot of innovation. And I'm really excited for everyone listening here to think about ways to innovate on that. Nouns is one example. One noun a day. Well, 10 nouns. One noun out of every 10 is reserved for the team. The proceeds go to a treasury. There's so many other options, and I hope that we as a community can move towards something that helps build sustainable NFT projects in the long term and rewards people for contributions rather than gas wars. I think that we'll get to that position as a community, and innovation like nouns and loot is just the start.
Absolutely. One other kind of question. I always have two more, and then we'll wrap it up and let you get back to your day. What are some kind of lessons learned from launching Adventure Gold, and what was the community reaction like, and sort of just what happened there post that tweet, and if you could do something differently, what would you have done?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had no idea how big Adventure Gold would get. I wrote it in 4 hours in an airport. I launched it live on a Clubhouse call. The day I launched it, I ended up running support for 24 hours straight. I'd woken up at 5 a.m. that day, and I went to sleep at 5 a.m. that day. I was not expecting the way Adventure Gold played out by any means. I think that the thing that was really good about Adventure Gold was that it was a fair launch. It was something where I didn't reserve any Adventure Gold for myself. I own some loot, and owning that loot gave me some Adventure Gold, but I didn't reserve any Adventure Gold for myself. And I think that allowed it to be adopted by the community, because it wasn't about anyone making money. It was about doing something good for the community. And I think that fair launches, especially for NFT derivatives, is very important, because it shows that these are not cash grabs. These are instead ways to further the whole ecosystem that everyone cares about. The interesting part is I expected Adventure Gold holders and loot holders to have a lot of overlap. And initially, every loot holder could claim Adventure Gold. But the groups diverged so much where after a few days, only 55% of loot holders held Adventure Gold. And there was a vote on whether Adventure Gold should govern loot, and that was split 50-50. So the split was extremely similar to the split of the number of loot holders who held Adventure Gold. And I think that the diverging interests between Adventure Gold, loot, and more loot means that stakeholder management is more difficult. And if I could do it all over again, I probably would add vesting or streaming to Adventure Gold. Instead of getting all your Adventure Gold up front, you maybe get some Adventure Gold every single day for holding loot, and then loot holders would be more aligned with Adventure Gold holders. I'd actually coded seasons into the contract. So you could start a new claim season and have a new batch of Adventure Gold available to claim. And I thought those seasons would be used pretty frequently. I didn't design the tokenomics to force those seasons to happen. So it's up for a vote by the DAO. It's not on any regular schedule. If I designed the tokenomics to offer the seasons on a regular schedule, I think that would have created more alignment with loot holders and Adventure Gold holders. So this is why I think the NFT tokenomics and the any derivative tokenomics are really important to get right, because a lot of your NFTs will change hands. Your projects will be held by a really wide variety of people. Some will be short-term minded, some will be long-term minded. And if you want a really thriving community in the long term with lots of builders and not just something that like is popular and then disappears, you should like do what Loot did and what I think more Loot and Adventure Gold serve to do, which is make a very expansive ecosystem for builders in a way that brings a lot of people into the fold. There's lots of ways to do it. but the scarcity versus abundance mindsets are very different. And if I'd coded in a forced seasons where a season would take place every 3 months, let's say, that would create an abundance mindset by default about Adventure Gold. I'd say Adventure Gold has more of a scarcity mindset right now, because the seasons are by vote instead of part of the tokenomics design up front.
Oh, incredible. I think you already sort of helped me transition to the last question here from our audience, which is if you had any predictions for what the loot ecosystem would look like a couple of years from now, what would you sort of say would happen?
Yeah. So there's currently a loot hackathon with like 50 different projects submitted. You saw that derivatives page I was screen sharing. There's like dozens of loot derivatives. And just because not a lot of people are talking about it on Twitter, that doesn't mean that there's not builders. The builders I know are more excited than ever. And I think that the loot community has really strong builders working on tons of different ideas. And I'm so excited to see those develop. These ideas are hard to execute. Loot Mart was started pretty close to day one, and it took a while to launch because it was incredibly complex. They had machine learning to generate the images. Each image took a long time, and it was very computationally intensive to generate. That's not something you can launch overnight. The loot ecosystem takes time because really good building and really good projects take time. I think my call to action for the loot community and the NFT community as a whole is to think about the long term. Think about what your NFTs look like in 3 years and 5 years, because people move on from profile photos. People will move on from all but a few assets. Just like in the 2017 ICO bubble, most ICOs are now valueless. I think that in 3 to 5 years, honestly, most NFTs will be valueless. And the ones that will survive will be the ones that cultivate these thriving communities, where it's more than just an image, it's an entire community and ecosystem around these NFTs. So NFTs are unique. They can be integrated into the ecosystem in all these different ways. Loot has an example of how to do that. Nouns has an example of how to do that. And yeah, think about how to go beyond images and into something that builders want to build on and communities want to create lore around, and something that goes beyond a profile photo.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. And I hope this is insightful for everybody else listening in too. We're already getting a lot of claps, and thank you for kind of clarifying a lot of these things. So really appreciate this, and thanks again.
Thanks so much. Yeah, anyone who wants to email me, you can email me at will@syndicate.io or contact me on Twitter at Will Papper. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks so much.
Sounds great. Thanks, Will.